Hello and welcome to this brief accordance training video for students at St Francis College as we look at the recommended settings for your preferences pane, which may also be called settings on your menu. So let's begin by going to the file menu, accordance menu. We're going to go down to settings here. It may look slightly different on a Windows machine than on a Mac, but I'm recording this on a Mac. And what will come up are the preferences pane, and there's actually 30 different panes within the preferences section. And it's important, or there's an opportunity at least, to configure your particular copy of Accordance so that it works the way you want it to work. It looks up the resources that you have available on your machine, and it produces the output and so on that you're wanting it to provide. So let's begin by looking at the options under General Preferences. One of the first things you'll want to do is decide where you want it to go when it starts up. You may have a particular workspace, and we'll talk about workspaces at some other time. You may have you can set your starting options so that it goes to a particular workspace. It's recommended that you don't use last session, because if your last session you are doing some unusual searches, you won't necessarily want that to be your default opening. I have mine set to a favorite workspace. I have more than one workspace which has been created, but for the present time I've got one set up for Intro to Biblical Languages, and this has been configured so that it has only those resources which you're likely to have as part of the green collection. So it'll have biblical texts, it'll have the Erdman's Comet Dictionary, it'll have BDB, which is Brown Driver Briggs Old Testament Lexicon, it'll have Lauer and Nida, which is a New Testament Greek lexicon. It'll have the atlas, and it has the timeline. And down the bottom I have things like the LXX apparatus, the Nestle Aland apparatus, and actually I should have had this as we'll leave it as Dead Sea Scroll Bible variants for now. So the first thing is to decide is what you want to do in terms of where you want it to open up with Workspace. Secondly, there's a number of things you may want to turn off. So you probably don't need to see the Accordance splash screen every time your software opens. Similarly, you may not need to see the splash screen every time you open a new, every time you open a Bible module, whether that's the Hebrew Bible or the NRSV or whatever. Save warnings can probably be suppressed, but leave them on if you like. But I've suppressed the opening splash screen, the opening text information, and the save warnings, but I've left active the idea of information tips, because that's really helpful when you're starting to use Accordance. Secondly, down below, I've left it pretty well default. The only thing I've changed is about showing the stack when adding options, when adding items. You may or may not want to leave that on, and I've got it set so that the arrow keys can also function to choose the insertion point. Then we start moving our way down the list, and the next one we come to is Amplify. And here you have, this is when you triple click on a word or a passage and you amplify it, so you expand the resources available. So you will need to choose whatever dictionary you have available, which will probably be Erdman's, which is down here on my list because it's the last one added. I'll be leaving mine with the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary because that's my preferred academic Bible dictionary. With Greek texts, my preferred lookup is BDAG, but you will have to choose Lao and NIDA. You use the pop down menu, you go down to the one that you have. There's Lao and NIDA. Again, I'm going to leave mine on BDAG. For the Hebrew text, you'll be able to use BDB, but I will leave mine on Halot for now. I've set just a default Latin dictionary for any Latin terms that might be used. I don't really use Latin text for the Bible, whatever, very often. And I've asked it to take the verse references from the Torah Modern Commentary series. I could make it any one I want, so let me actually change that to say I want it to be the same as NRSV with Strong's. That way there'll be the maximum compatibility with I've just got to find NRSV with Strong's after all of that, because there's quite a lot of Bible options that I have here. Okay. Interesting. Okay. So let me just go, I'll just go NRSV notes. I'm not quite sure exactly why that's important. And then with Greek numbers, I'm using the Strong's references rather than some of the other systems that are available, because that's what you will have. And similarly, for the Hebrew numbering system, again, we'll stay with Strong. We won't be using the Kohlenberger ones at this stage. Other things you might want to do is, if you're amplifying, actually require the whole word to be selected rather than just having the cursor in the word. I've left the references out when amplifying, and basically told it to stay within the confines of the page. Don't yet hit OK, because that's for all of the adjustments to preferences which you've made. If we go into appearance, there's a few things you might want to play around with. One is to choose the general color scheme that you want. I'm using lime, which gives me this green kind of appearance. There's the classic accordance one, and you can do a preview to see what it looks like. I actually quite like lime as my default color, so I've gone back to that. I've clicked automatically adjust the display to dark mode if you have that option turned on your computer. Text appearance, I've told it to use SPL, standard abbreviations, because they're the default for our kind of academic work rather than the European system for chapter and verse. I've defined a width, but it doesn't really matter what you choose there. Quick entry, I've chosen medium rather than small or large. And then just a few other things. I've just mostly gone for default for the rest of this. White background for pictures, you don't have to have that. And I'm suppressing the table of contents when for auto sizing when I open a tool. Coming to keyboard shortcuts, probably nothing there you need to change at this stage, but just note there are some shortcuts that are already predefined. Command 1, Command 2, Command 3, Command D to duplicate, Command O to open, and so on. Okay, so there may be some things there that you'll want to get familiar with, but they will also show up in the window when you select them the longer way from the file menu. Workspaces, you can define how many zones you can have in a workspace. I've chosen to add instant details to a new workspace. You can turn that off, you can turn it on. It's entirely your call. There's nothing much there to play with really. Under text display, this is where you get to make it look the way you want it to look. So by default, I'm choosing SBL Biblical Literature as my font, because that'll work fine for English, Hebrew, Arabic, Greek, etc. I'm also going to change my references to SBL Biblical Languages so that that'll look the same. I've chosen black for the color of the font. I've gone for size 16. You can choose whatever size you like. I've chosen to have the background as parchment down here. I could make it look like a newspaper. I could make it look like the sky. I could make it look pink. You can do what you like. I just happen to like the parchment as a background for Bible and other texts. Okay. Similarly, I've checked the font size. I've chosen paragraphs with a space between as the default. The other options are paragraphs with no space, separate verses, no space, separate verses with spaces. So for example, if I went separate verses with spaces, you can see in the preview what it's going to look like. I'm going to take it back to paragraph with space. It'll do a paragraph at a time. Tool display, much the same. Again, you've got some predefined options to choose from. And because I've made changes, mine is a custom one. I've kept the font sizes the same. I'm using SBL Biblical Literature font. Highlighting results in red. Hypertext in blue. That's fairly predictable. NRSV with Strong's. Now I have some other English Bibles, so I've chosen the New Jerusalem Bible as my alternate text. You probably have to use ESV or something. And this is letting me see what it looks like. Remember, this is not for the Bible. This is for dictionaries and lexicons and such like. If you don't want to see the page numbers, you can hide them, but actually it can be useful to see the page numbers. Exporting. If you want to export something out of Accordance and take it into Microsoft Word or whatever, the best thing to do is to say all characters export with Unicode format. That's really a no-brainer these days. And then that also automatically shades out the others. You don't have to choose a Greek font or a Hebrew font because it's going to be Unicode. So that's simple. As an external style sheet and so on. But the main thing is that you actually have checked export all characters with Unicode. Otherwise you have to choose which font to use, and if they're not Unicode, there's going to be problems. Okay, so Unicode is the way to go. Greek and Hebrew, well, some things you don't want to mess with. Automatic final letter, automatic diacritical marks. Use the Greek polytonic keyboard. You probably don't want to use the Israeli keyboard because that's not the Hebrew QWERTY keyboard. So it won't have some of the vowel signs and so on. So I've left that unchecked. You can choose to have old-fashioned or modern grammatical terms. I learned the old-fashioned ones because I'm an old codger, but I'm trying to use the modern terms when teaching and working with students. And then there's just, again, I wouldn't mess with any of these things in particular at this stage. Unicode display, again, I've just said SBL font, SBL font. Arabic is not SBL literature, so I've gone with Accordance font. Although I suppose I could make that SBL as well. We'll see what happens the next time I look at. And I've done the same with Coptic, which you won't need to worry about, but there will be some times when there are texts which are in Coptic, and these are all Unicode export. Okay. Comparing texts, this is when you're having two parallel panes and you're wanting to look at them and compare things. I'm choosing words, but I could have lexical forms or tags, but by default I'll go words. Multiple text rather than a single text. Ignore uppercase, ignore punctuation. don't ignore Greek accents and breathing marks. Don't ignore Hebrew pointing. Do ignore the Hebrew cantillation marks, the chanting marks. They're not part of the Hebrew text. Color codes, I think I've just stayed with the default. And Old Testament source texts, I'll be choosing Biblica Hebraica Deuterogensia, because that's what we get in the Green Collection. NA28 for the Greek, and for a keyed English text, NRSV with Strong's. Okay. Instant details, you can format that to include or exclude various features. I'll pretty well just left it in the default setting there. If you really don't want to be bothered with all this information, just click it off. Okay, but I think I'd by default turn everything on. Okay, and if you're not sure here, turn on full words instead of abbreviations, but I'm going to go with abbreviations. Arranging the tags, this will become very important in terms of parsing, and basically just go with the default. Don't make any changes there. Citation, this is when you're copying something as a citation, you're going to paste it into an essay, whatever. So I've got show as paragraphs, but there are a number of options. Okay. If there are verses which are discontiguous, I've said to split them. I don't want it to suppress poetry. I do want it to hide superscripts like A, B, C, D. In terms of what I've done, all I've really done here is to choose where I want the citation to show up and what sort of markers I want around it. Okay. So that's just check that you've got something roughly like that. You can always come back and change it. The bibliography tab, again, you get to choose up here what format of bibliography do you want, and there's quite a number of them there. You perhaps should choose Chicago footnote, because that's the style required by the University of Divinity, but most of my academic writing is done for SBL type publications, so I'm going to take SBL bibliography as my style. And again, I can change it at any stage. Speech, I've just got the bibliography coming out of SBL. Sorry, I didn't went back into the same one. Go into speech, and you can choose different voices. The default is Daniel. Greek is a woman's voice called Melina, or you can have Fred if you like. Hebrew is Karmet, and Arabic is Majid. And we can test what it's like by saying, try the voice.
Hello, my name is Daniel. I am a British English voice.
We could make that a bit faster. Let's try Majid. Let's go down here, see whether you like the sound. That's the only option you've got for Arabic.
مرحبا اسمي ماجد أنا صوت عربي.
Okay, Majid is a man, obviously. So I'll just make him a bit faster.
مرحبا اسمي ماجد أنا صوت عربي.
Okay, so you will probably only need to set default Greek and Hebrew. You won't probably be doing Arabic, although there are one or two people in the class who will be working with the Arabic text. Under search tabs, again, you choose what's going to be the default search option. So I'm suggesting, if you have it, NRSV with Strong's. If you don't, well, you pick another text, but then you won't have all of these texts. But you'll probably want to set it to an English Bible. Okay, so I'm suggesting NRSV with Strong's. A verse is the basic scope. The range is everything in that document. In other words, from Genesis to Revelation. Focusing on verses. I don't want any context added. I just want the immediate verse. And you can also manually adjust that later. I'm happy to have flex search rather than just exact search. Flex is more flexible. It'll find more stuff. You don't have to be quite so pedantic. And the default analytics, you can turn these off if you're not interested. I guess by default, accordance comes like this, with just maybe those two active. I like to also see the others, but you don't have to have them showing up automatically. You can always add them. But so you can play around with that and always come back and change it at a later stage. But I like these features. Parallel tabs. Again, you choose which sort of parallel you're talking about. Okay. So in the case of the Gospels, I've said what I want to happen there. If I was to look at New Testament epistle parallels, again, I'm just using the NRSV with Strong's, and I don't have an extra text. That's fine. Another version of synoptic parallels using a different synopsis. Well, we don't want the text to be from the Hebrew Bible. That's not going to work. So let's say Greek, just because we're fancy people. Old Testament parallels were clearly, we probably wanted to be NRSV with Strong's, but you could choose Biblical Hebraica. And then the Q sayings, of course, the pericopes that form part of the Q, again, you don't want Hebrew Bible. You're either going to want Greek or NRSV, so let's go NRSV. And Old Testament quotations in the New Testament. Okay, so for the Old Testament part, you probably want, at this stage of your learning, you'll want NRSV for both, or maybe, yes, because that's all you have, and because you're not going to be really working with the Hebrew and Greek. I was tempted to go Torah, a modern Jewish commentary, or even the JPS, Jewish Publication Society here with Strong's numbers. Now you won't have that, but let me show off. I've got that one. So that gives me a Jewish translation and a Jewish commentary, and then and with Strong's numbers, and then I'll stick with the NRSV. Okay. So they're your options. So under parallel tabs, there's another 6 or 7 options. Coming now to reading/research. For daily readings, I don't actually use, and I don't want to use their daily reading schedule, but you can have devotional readings or you can have chronological readings. Your choice, your computer. I'll go chronological. I want maximum readability. I'll put the default font size to 18. Again, pick a number from the list, because I should make it 16, same as everything else. The language is going to be English. The search group is everything in my accordance, and I want it sorted by importance, or I could have it sorted alphabetically, or I could have it sorted by library entry, but let's say importance. And show results in full text, show hits in browser. Just for the heck of it, let's do that, but again, your call. Live click, again, there's probably nothing much here you'll need to adjust at this point. There's nothing there that I'm going to change, but it's just if you want to configure that differently. Over here I have chosen Lexeme for looking up the Greek and Hebrew, the lexical form, not the inflected form, and by default it'll do key number searches rather than word numbers. Okay, that picks up things like love, loves, loved, and loving, and so on. It'll pick it up straight away using the key numbers, so that's one you might want to check. External websites. I've never used this area, but there's a whole lot of default search thingies and various digital libraries and so on. Then there's a whole set of other resources, and it just depends on your personal interests and your own theological tendencies as to whether, for example, you want to have access to the Adventist Digital Library or the Andrews University Library or the Orthodox Wiki, which is Greek Orthodox, and so on. So external websites you want the accordance to have easy access to. User files, these are the files you create with your own notes, and this is a really powerful feature of accordance in terms of your own ideas, your own questions, your own insights, even ideas for sermons and so on by using user files. Again, you can choose how you want things to be organized there. I've gone with the NRSV UE, which is the latest inclusive language updated version. You choose whatever. You might just want to have NRSV with Strongs, for example. Syncing, I have mine syncing with Dropbox, my Dropbox account. You can have it syncing to a mobile device. I can't quite see the point of that. And then if you are linked with Dropbox, you can unlink it or relink it and so on. And these are the items to be synced. By default, I've just got everything being synced and backed up. Web and text browser, again, I wouldn't change much here. Make sure you've got the correct Bible versions in there. Now, you probably only have a couple of versions at the moment. I've got lots of them, of course. I don't want it to suppress poetry. I don't care about the size of the fonts in this case. When exporting, I do want it to include heading details, but I wanted to hide the verse reference, hide the superscripts, okay? Again, you can play around with these and see which looks best on your machine. Atlas tab layers. So you can set your background. Now I've gone for light brown for the maps. Some people like vivid, some people like satellite. I've chosen light brown. Entirely up to you. In the sites area, I've chosen major biblical sites as the default. I could have Old Testament sites, New Testament sites, sites that are mentioned in the Pentateuch, etc. Or I can have Old and New Testament sites. Okay. For regions, by default, so what do we want to have by default? You could have nothing chosen by default as the region, or you could have, I'm going to say New Testament Palestine, but I can always zoom out to other things. The routes, the roadways, I've chosen ancient highways. In fact, let me change that to ancient major highways. And the user layers, maybe I did. I didn't think I defined any user layers, but perhaps I have at some stage. Atlas tab display. Now there's a couple of things here that are important, and some more coming up with timeline. You can check whether you want region names to be showing up, and I think I do want regions rather than routes. I wouldn't bother changing the fonts for that. Some of them are animated, and some of them are not, so I've just left it on normal. And hypertext, in this case you'd have Erdmann's dictionary, so you'd go click, you'd go down to Erdmann's at this stage, but I've got Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. Almost there. Timeline layers. Okay. So you can choose not to focus in at all, but so you can have all regions. That makes it very hard to read. I've chosen to focus on ancient Israel and neighbors because that's the immediate biblical context. Okay, I could have Israel and Greece. I could Israel and Mesopotamia, but I've just chosen Israel and neighbours for now. And with item layers, I don't want the dates that come from Bishop Ussher in Ireland 300 years ago that tells me that Adam was made on the 26th of October in the year 4004 BC. That's all nonsense. But you can have various items. I've got everything but Ussher. Just don't give me the Ussher dates. Your call. Dates, you've got critical or conservative. There aren't that many places where this makes a huge difference. The two most obvious places will be three. The conservative dates will try to put dates on the non-historical characters like Abraham and Joseph and Jacob. You may not have come across them as not being historical figures. It'll also have an early date for the Exodus rather than a later date, and it'll have the dates of the kingdom of Judah and Israel set to the more conservative options, not the options preferred by critical scholars in Israel and North America. So, surprise, surprise, I choose critical, but you can always flick between them. I'll show you some other time how to do that when we get to the timeline module. Timeline display, that's what we've just been on. No, here we go. So the only other thing here, you want to put in some hypertext, because if there's a name on the timeline of a person, for example, you can double or triple click on that. It'll take you to your Bible dictionary. In your case, that's Erdman's to start with. In my case, it's Anchor Yale. And similarly, the default text, NRSV with Strong's. Up here, I don't want BCAD, I want BCE and CE. Means exactly the same thing, just BCE and CE is slightly more inclusive of other cultural and religious traditions. Jewish people really don't want to have their dates for the Old Testament as before Christ. So before the Common Era works better for interfaith stuff. Word chart tabs. Again, I would choose SBL Biblical Literature font, regular style, I'd go color, and I wouldn't change anything else. And you'll get to see what the word chart looks like in a couple of weeks. Finally, updates. It's just saying check for updates to the application, the program. Daily, hourly, not likely, weekly, monthly, I've got daily. And then I'm going to check automatically download available updates without even asking, just do it. Okay? Modules, that's things like the NRSV with Strong's or Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary. I don't want to check that every day, maybe every week, maybe every month. But let's say weekly, but it could be monthly just as easily. Doesn't matter much. Now, when everything is done to your satisfaction, you've got all the preferences set the way you want, or you've finished modifying the one preference you came in to change, you click OK. Do I want these new settings to apply to the texts that are already open? Yes. So now everything, I don't want that, that's my new cursor toy. So now I'm ready to go back in and start using it. So in my scripture tag, I've got NRSV with Strong's, I've got Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, the Hebrew Bible from Stuttgart. I've got the Septuagint Ralph's edition, all of them are tagged, and I've got the NA Nestle Aland 28th edition Greek New Testament. Okay, so if I was to type in something, so I just hit tab, if I was to type Isaiah 6, for example, it's going to turn up in the English, it's going to turn up in the Hebrew, it's going to turn up in the Septuagint, it's not going to turn up in the New Testament, okay, because it's an Old Testament reference. All right, so that's enough for this one. We'll come back and look at other micro skills with accordance in subsequent videos, but this video has been really just focused on helping you get back into the preferences area called settings and set each of your preferences the way you want them to be. So good luck with all that. There is also a PDF which has screenshots of these different screens, and between the video and the PDF, I hope you'll be able to configure your copy of Accordance just the way you want it.